Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Politics and Governance webinar. I am Rodrigo Silva, the Communications Manager at Cogitatio, and we are here today to explore how recent rule changes in the European Union institutions impact the way legislation is passed. The event is based on a thematic issue, which was published in our open access journal, Politics and Governance. I will share the link to the issue soon in the chat. And to explore this topic, today, we have Ariadna Ripoll Servent from the University of Salzburg, co-editor of this issue, Aron Buzogány from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Austria, and Viviane Gray, the co-author of Aron, and also Angela Tacea from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel in Belgium, also co-editor of this issue. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Richard Corbett. He is the former Labour leader in the European Parliament. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Allow me for our audience to provide you with more information concerning this webinar. So this will be the order of presentations today. Ariadna will contextualize a little bit about the issue we are discussing today. She will be followed by Aron and Viviane, and then Angela, and then Richard. After that, we will jump to the Q&A session. And so to our attendees, you can ask your questions to our speakers throughout the whole session using the Q&A format on the bottom of your screen. We kindly ask you to indicate the person to whom you're directing the question. Also, if you are on Twitter, feel free to follow us at CogitatioPag. You can see the handle on the bottom of the screen to keep in touch our publications, call for papers, the impact of our research on news outlets, blogs, governmental documents, etc. And without further delay, I will now pass the word to Ariadna and wish you all a pleasant webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for this introduction. So, and thanks to all the audience for being here and joining us today. So, basically, I'm professor of of European politics, and I've been working on these issues now for quite a long time, trying to have a look at how changes in the treaties, in the rules, have an impact on policy outcomes, especially in the area of migration and justice and home affairs. And by doing this kind of research, I realized that this is a phenomenon that is not just particular to this specific policy area that I'm looking at, but that is a phenomenon that happens more broadly in the European Union. And we can, for instance, have a look at the situation now with the COVID pandemic. We've seen that there has been lots of important changes induced by the pandemic, right? So the fact that, for instance, all of the institutions had to go into lockdown, that meant that the rules of the change, the way the institutions work, change a lot very quickly due to this crisis. So suddenly the European Parliament couldn't meet, it had to vote remotely, it had to meet remotely. The Commission also was meeting remotely, the same with the Council, the European Council. So then the question is, of course, how does it affect then the way that solutions are found? Does it affect the way the game functions, the way that different people participate in this game? Or does it also have an impact on what comes out of this game, on which solutions do we find? And for instance, during the pandemic, we saw how some actors, some people did try to make use of this new situation to, for instance, push some decisions to present some deals as ready-made deals. For instance, the Council and the Commission presenting deals that were ready-made to the European Parliament. And that, for instance, forcing also the European Parliament to retaliate a little bit and make sure that they also could participate in decision-making. But the question is, of course, even if the European Parliament managed to, in the end, participate in these decisions, did it actually make a difference? So did it have a consequence also for what came out of this game, of this process of decision making? And did it make a difference, for instance, when it came to the economic recovery instruments that we decided in during the COVID pandemic and the COVID recovery instruments? And this is, for instance, an example of what motivated our research and what motivated this thematic issue. So we wanted to understand whether these changes in the rules of the game, whether they have actually an impact also on policies. So whether they also affect what comes out of the machine. And we've heard a lot of discussions about who wins and who loses in the European Union, about whether the European Parliament has become more powerful, or whether the European Council has become more powerful, whether the Commission is losing powers now that the European Parliament has more powers, whether it's becoming more politicized, and whether this also has an impact on decision making. And the question was a bit, so does this matter? So do these discussions about who wins, who loses, do they matter then in the end for what comes out of this machine of European Union decision making? So what we did in this thematic issue was to look at different types of rule change. So we didn't restrict ourselves at looking at formal changes, for instance, changes in the treaties. And this is, of course, one of the most common. We've seen this, especially with the broadening of what we call co-decision. So the fact that the European Parliament can now co-decide with the Council in most issues. But we also looked at more informal changes. So the fact that, for instance, now many agreements are decided in informal settings like trilogue, so in secluded decision making, or the impact that the crisis have had, for instance, in empowering the European Council. So we had a concept of rule change that was relatively broad. What are the main results that come out of these thematic issues? The first one is that probably there have been fewer changes in EU policies than we could expect. We've had lots of changes in the rules, in the institutions, in the way that this game is played. But in the end, what comes out of it is that we see more stability or very small changes rather than radical changes. And Angela and Aron and Viviane will show you also some examples of this, because they look at areas where we see this stability rather than change. So basically, despite all these major changes, despite having also all these crises, economic crisis, the refugee crisis, now COVID and so on, we see actually that policy stability prevails, especially in issues that are very politicized. So issues as the ones we will look now at now, so migration, security, agriculture, where winners and losers are very clear, where there are lots of conflicts. It's much easier for those who do not want to see any changes to win, rather than find some sort of coalitions that really can push, especially for big changes. And we've seen that, especially with the Council and the European Parliament being more and more fragmented, we see that there are lots of conflicts within these institutions, ideological conflicts, that this makes it even more complicated to then have radical changes or important changes in these policies. What we've also seen with comparing the different cases that we've looked at is that the different crises have been actually very good for the Commission. So the Commission has been very good at using crisis to redefine its powers and extend them also towards areas where it didn't have strong competences. And that is, for instance, a question that comes up now also in the pandemic, whether this will be again an opportunity for the Commission to maybe expand its competences, especially, for instance, in the area of health policies. But we've also seen at the same time that the Commission has become more dependent on the European Parliament, especially when formal powers apply. So for instance, when the European Parliament has a formal power to co-decide, to act as a legislator, or to give its consent, for instance, in international agreements, there the Commission is very dependent on the wishes of the European Parliament. But also it has been very good at searching for alternatives. So either finding ways of avoiding legislation, of trying not to legislate and finding other types of ways of finding solutions to problems, or bypassing the European Parliament also through other means. And for instance, the agreement between the European Union and Turkey when it came to migration is a very good example of this attempts to bypassing the European Parliament. So let me just finish with two main lessons for the future that we can draw from our thematic issue. One of them is that we need to be careful about how we analyze the impact of rule change on policy output. So it's important that we identify very clearly what are we talking about? How can we identify whether there has been policy change or not, whether things have changed or not, and in respect to what? So in respect to previous legislation, or in respect, for instance, to what is implemented on the ground, or in respect to how member states used to do things beforehand. So what are we comparing? And also, how important are these changes? Are these really big changes that will have kind of a long-term effect, or are they just more window dressing and things that we know that then are maybe not going to be implemented? So how deep are really these changes? And the second point is also that we need to better understand how policy change is really linked to these changes in the rules. So, is there really a link between new rules or new ways of working in the institutions, new actors entering the game, and then changes in the policies, or is it completely disconnected? And if it is connected, then how is it connected? And that's kind of my final point, that we need to be also a little bit more creative on how we get to explain this link. So we've tended, so from our side, so as academics, we've tended to look either at very big patterns, so trying to look at the general picture, but then failing to understand better how it happens, what is the role of different people, what is the role of different institutions in it, how do they affect policies, why is it that when certain people in the European Parliament participate, something happens, while when others participate, then something else happens, for instance. So what is really these mechanisms, or what is really, how does this happen? How does policy change happen in the European Union? But also not just fall into what many of us have been doing, which is look at specific policy areas and then not getting the big picture. So being experts in specific areas, in specific issues. So I can understand very well what is going in migration policies, and Viviane and Aron know very well what is going in agriculture, but often we fail to talk to each other. And this is extremely important if we want to really understand what are the patterns across different policies and what is the bigger picture here. And of course, then it's also a question about how to get data, so how to get better information about these processes. But this is probably something that Angela and Aron and Viviane can show you. So I'll give Aron and Viviane the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariadna. Thank you for this overview of the issue. We'll now be hearing from Aron and Viviane.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, all of you. And thank you also for the editors, for the two editors who are here to put together this, this special issue. Basically, I just want to underline what Ariadna has just said. So it really helped us to have the bigger picture. And our part of the puzzle is actually agricultural policy. So that's what you have in the back of Viviane. So landscapes, agriculture, and so on. And we are coming from environmental / agricultural policy. So this is our perspective on rule change. And there has been a lot of talk, and there is still ongoing talk about rule change in the CAP, in the Common Agricultural Policy. The Common Agricultural Policy, that's not only us who are looking at this policy saying, is probably the biggest and the most important, and of course for sure the biggest policy field of the European Union. It accounts still, though it was much more, for 40% of the budget. It's very expensive. It's huge. It has been under strict intergovernmentalism for basically forever, and it was the last policy where the EP became a co-legislator, and it was the last policy where which basically got under co-decision. So this is obviously an interesting field for us to look at through this through this perspective. Ariadna has proposed us in this special issue and took us on this road to look at more at the institutional part of it. So what we do in this paper, I won't really get too much into detail because we have a bit to share times, because Vivian will in the second part look at what is happening actually and where we could go further. But what we do in this paper, we look at the 2013 reform. So this is the last big reform. The actual is going on now, and we look at this by taking two perspectives. So one big question in the literature is whether the EP, the European Parliament, after the reforms, after the Lisbon Treaty, essentially, can it use its new powers? So this is a huge discussion. Many of the papers in this special issue have talked to this, but there is also one other discussion which is equally relevant for us, and this is about whether the European Parliament is still progressive, whether it can be progressive. And this is a huge discussion in many policy fields. We grew up with this discussion in the environmental policy, where the European Parliament has been for many years seen as, the green pioneer, as Charlie Burns has put it. But Vivian's work on digitalization, on migration, and so on shows that basically the same happened very much in other policy fields. So the EP was very progressive in many of these policy fields, whereas the member states were not so. So in our case, this is not the case. In our case, the EP is pretty different. So the European Parliament, or mostly its agricultural committee, is basically the place where non-progressiveness in greening the agriculture is sitting. So what we do in this paper is basically to look at rule change, and we basically think of rule change in inter-institutional relations. We look at the relations between the Agri Committee and the Commission. We look at also the relations between the plenary of the EP and the ComAgri, the agriculture committee, because we know that the conflicts are here is where the conflicts within the EP are happening. So Agri is being stuck with farmers, at least traditionally, and the plenary being mostly more progressive, also with people sitting in the environmental committee and so on. So conflicts are here to stay. And then we also look at a third dimension. We look at the plenary versus the European Parliament versus the Council. And basically the question is what we try to evaluate: who is greener, in a way. So which of these actors, interparliamentary actors, is greener? And what we do empirically is something talking pretty much on to this agenda Ariadna was proposing, to look very, very focused to policy changes. So what we do is that we look at policy ambitions through the policy cycle. So we look how green basically a policy proposed by the different institutions, coming from the Commission, but then going through all the Parliament and ending up through the trialogues, ending up with the council and in a final decision. So how green are these? And we can compare these. I think this is a very innovative part of the paper. It makes sense for you to look at it. If you can download it for free, this is the big benefit of this journal. And what we, I won't get really much into details, but basically what we find here is that the EP has actually become more important in this game. It really got new powers. It has now its own agenda. It can shape policies. And this is, I think, also, if we think about policies, it's important to look at the integrity. It's important to look at the policies which are within bigger policies. And this is something which we very often fail to do, but we do it in this paper, and there is a way how to do it also for others proposed. So this is one finding. This is maybe from this progressive part, from this progressive discussion, it's a bit far. But if we want to, if we look at the EP, whether it became more progressive, we can't really say so. So the EP got more powers, but it didn't get much more greener. Even though if we look more closely, we can see that there are differences between the policies they are proposing, but there are, of course, big conflicts embedded between the ComAgri and the EP. And this is something where we end. Our closing note is in the paper saying that, well, this is something that will continue and something we will witness in the next CAP reform. And this is actually what we are looking at now at the moment. And this is what Viviane will now shortly introduce.
Yes, thank you very much, Aron. So very quickly, we thought our paper in the special issue talks about the 2013 reform, but of course we are right now in the middle or at the very end of the 2021 reform. So how do our results in that paper hold up? What we're seeing is that, in the 2013 paper, we showed actually, okay, the EP overall has its own greening agenda, but it wasn't convinced by the Commission. So we were ending on a note of hope that if the Commission comes up with a strong green proposal, perhaps the EP will support it. And that today we can say that's not the case, because we had a Commission. The CAP proposal itself was not super progressive. Again, this time around, the CAP proposal was inherited from the previous Juncker Commission. But we've had with Commissioner President von der Leyen, a strong push for the European Green Deal and a strong ask by the Commission to the European Parliament and the Council to revise upward the Commission proposal through the legislative process to align it with the European Green Deal. And neither the Council nor the Parliament really did that. So applying the same method of following through the ambition of these instruments, we show that actually our note of hope for the European Parliament, or as a progressive actor on agriculture, second time around is even worse. And so that's not great from a parliamentary perspective. But to go back to Ariadna's point on the importance of looking at rule change and perhaps how the Commission can get stronger again, what we're seeing is that, we were also ending our paper on this issue saying, the only way for the Commission to green is to get the Parliament on board. And actually what we're seeing is that the Commission is doing something different this time. They're actually deciding to make the CAP even less common, because we are going to move, as we have seen in energy already, to national plans. And so what we're moving is to actually something that was quite formal with the legislative process and with co-decision. We're going to move to now bilateral discussion between one member state and the Commission on the national plans to implement the CAP. For now, this commissioner has said he will not use that discussion to force alignment with the European Green Deal. That doesn't mean that future commissioner won't. In any case, that kind of moves a lot of that big debate and perhaps stuck completely discussion on how to reform the CAP back to bilateral relations with the Commission. So, in many ways, we're going after decades of kind of a stuck policy or politics in terms of who is deciding common agricultural policy. We're not keeping on changing rules, and that's all for us.
Thank you, Aron and Viviane, for your presentation, for perspectives for the future. We'll be hearing now from Angela. Tacea.
you very much. I will move on to another area that is quite intense in terms of the legislative activity, because justice and home affairs is actually, together with agriculture and environment, one of the most prolific sectors of legislative activity in the EU. And it's not only an intense legislative area, but it's also one of the most, I would say, sensitive fields of public policy, because, as you know, it deals with immigration, border control, counterterrorism, citizens and migrants' access to justice and rights. So it is important to understand how EU institutions participate and actually exercise influence in the lawmaking process. For those of you who are familiar with the academic research on this area, you might wonder, why do we need yet another study on this? And actually, the answer is that what we find in the studies that are already there is that the results are contrasting and even contradictory, I would say, because from a practical point of view, if we look at the evolution of the European Parliament, we can say that now it is exercising an equal influence to that of the Council, because its role was significantly increased after all the EU successive treaties. However, when we look at it from a theoretical point of view, such a claim is less straightforward, because we have authors, for example, that argued that the power of the European Parliament actually increased with the generalization of this co-decision procedure. But authors that look specifically at justice and home affairs policy suggest that the influence of the European Parliament, a little bit like in agriculture, on the legislative outputs is still limited, and the Council is still dominating the legislative procedure. Who's right? I don't have an answer to this question, because it's hard to say who's right. The first ones are actually relying on mathematical modeling of the whole EU legislative procedure, while the second ones are studying very salient justice and home affairs issues. So some of them are missing basically the bigger picture of the EU decision-making process, while the others are ignoring the fact that there are clear limits to the applicability of general theories to specific policy fields. So my main objective in the paper, and also in my research, is to connect those two types of academic studies in order to better understand the lawmaking in justice and home affairs. How I'm doing it and how did I do it in the paper? I first built a data set that maps basically the whole lawmaking process in justice and home affairs and the actors involved, and then identifies what are the changes from a textual point of view that the proposals undergo at each step of the legislative procedure. So from the text that the Commission proposes to the final version that is then published in the official journal. Then I use a machine learning approach, and I build a similarity index between the different versions of the text. So basically, I'm comparing the version that is proposed by the European Commission with the final adopted act, then the report adopted by the planner with the final adopted act, and so on and so forth for each step of the legislative procedure. What are the main findings? My data suggests, as it is the case in most of the literature on justice and home affairs, and also the literature in new decision-making process in general, that the role of the European Parliament is limited in the consultation procedure. For example, between 1999 and 2017, the European Parliament rejected 15% of the proposals initiated under consultation, and the Council simply ignored the opinion of the Parliament and adopted the act. However, the position of the Parliament in consultation is not radically different from that of the Council. And this is something completely different than what the studies that dealt with that suggested until now. When we look at the average similarity index between the final adopted act and the position of the European Parliament, it is 88.5%, so quite high. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but this tends to be the norm, and the exceptions are rather few. When it comes to the co-decision procedure, the distribution of power between the three institutions is a little bit more balanced. First, the European, or both the European Parliament and the European Commission actually proposed after the Lisbon Treaty texts that are not radically different from the final adopted act, which shows actually a more pragmatic negotiation strategy. Second, the European Parliament, as it was suggested actually by the studies on justice and home affairs, tend to compromise more with the Council after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty compared to the period before. However, this does not mean that the influence of the European Parliament is limited, because there are substantive parliamentary amendments that are incorporated in the final text. And lastly, the data suggests or shows a surprising phenomenon. After the Lisbon Treaty, most of the proposals, 40%, is not most, 40% of the proposals in this area were proposed not under co-decision, but under non-legislative procedures, which actually limits the role of the European Parliament and the influence that it might exercise, because its role in non-legislative procedure is rather limited. So this high increase in non-legislative procedures proves that the European Commission is actually choosing a strategy to limit the scope of the legislative powers the European Parliament gained with the extension of the co-decision procedure in justice and home affairs. Why those findings matter? By analyzing basically the evolution of the legislative text during the legislative procedure, we can clearly indicate which actor is responsible for the bulk of textual modifications of the legislative act, and at which stage. Is it at the informal? Is it at the formal level? So we can clearly see, for example, as Ariadna mentioned in the introduction, that after the Lisbon Treaty, most of the agreements are reached in informal negotiations, in those trilogues, which poses a problem of transparency for the citizens who do not have access or systematic access to them. My research suggests also that formal institutional change did not have much impact on the capacity of the European Parliament to influence outputs. And this raises the question of the utility of institutional reforms. Of course, there is scope for further inquiry into the causes of actors' success, because, for example, the resources actors have, like the expertise, for example, of a rapporteur, or the expertise of the DGs, or the incentives that they have in order to mobilize their power, like the salience of the proposal for the public opinion, might matter. Lastly, I truly believe that research should not only be for academics. The data set that I presented you, and that is on which the results is based, is publicly available. And I also developed a web application. I will put the link in the chat, that allows basically everyone to follow the legislative procedure in justice and home affairs. You will see that for each legislative procedure, the web application provides basically a visualization of the text adopted at each stage of the legislative process, and then this similarity index that can be freely downloaded from the application. To conclude, I would like to draw the attention of scholars and journalists and whoever uses automated data collection and text mining methods to analyze EU data to the poor quality of data provided by the EU institutions. This is also a plea for EU institutions to make their data reusable. And I'm giving you just two examples among many others. There are several documents, for example, from the European Parliament and from the Council from the period before 2003. In my case, it's approximately 150 procedures, but I'm talking only about justice and home affairs. So imagine if you generalize to all the policy sectors. In practice, some documents correspond on the websites of the institutions to completely different procedures. I'm giving you one example. There was one proposal in 2000 about fight against organized crime. If you're clicking on the link to the text adopted by the plenary on the Legislative Observatory of the European Parliament, you will find the text that talks about sexual exploitation of children. So the problem is that data then should be manually validated to ensure its validity, which limits the advantages of using automated data collection and analysis. A second problem is that data is not similarly structured in all the three institutions. You have, for example, the Commission that provides the full text, then you have the Parliament for the committees that provide only the amendments, and for the plenary eventually, but not systematically, the consolidated text, so the full text with the amendments included. And then you have the Council that provides the whole text that is modified using bold, underlying, straight through. And those discrepancies require important pre-processing efforts, because to be comparable, a text needs to have the same structure. So I know that the EU institutions are attached to the open data movement, but this does not mean simply making available data. It means that everybody should have the potential to make use of that data, which is actually not the case in practice.
Thank you, Angela, for your presentation. We will now be hearing from Richard Corbett, please.
Well, thank you very much. And it was fascinating to hear these academic presentations in the different fields which they've worked at in great detail. My role is to be here not as an academic. My academic pretensions are very small. I've co-authored the textbook, The European Union, How Does It Work?, which is published by Oxford University Press. But it's just about limited to that and a few other books. I'm really here as a previous practitioner. I was a member of the European Parliament for nearly 20 years. And in the middle of that, I took 5 years out where I was the senior policy advisor to the first president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. So I've seen these things from different institutional perspectives. And I would say, coming to the title of this seminar, how does rule changes affect the policy outcomes? We've had some good examples of rule changes at different levels. There are treaty changes. There are changes to the rules of procedure of the different institutions, and there are changes in institutional practice. An example of rule changes in the treaty, I mean, they are, of course, the treaty is the basic rule book of the European Union, the constitution, if you like. It lays down the basic procedures, how you adopt legislation, how you appoint people to the institutions. So they are the most important. And if you look at the most important rule changes that have affected policy outcomes over the years in successive changes to the treaties, I'd say the biggest one is, of course, the switch in many fields from unanimity to qualified majority voting. It's a rather obvious one. If it's unanimity, you tend to have slow minimum common denominator decision taking, and you're vulnerable to the veto of a single minister, which when you have 27 ministers now, it's much more difficult than many years ago. Now, every treaty revision from the Single Acts, Nice, Maastricht, Amsterdam, Lisbon, has increased the field of qualified majority voting rather than unanimity. That's good, but there is also the practice. We know that within the Council, member states, being national governments, all buddies together, all aware of their national interests, tend to be reluctant to actually outvote each other. They try to negotiate until there is a broad consensus, if not complete unanimity. For many years, there was even an interpretation. There was a thing called the Luxembourg Compromise, which is not in the treaty at all, but it was a gentleman's agreement among member states that if one of them said this is a very important interest, we'll keep the dialogue going to try and find a solution that you can accept. And some member states interpreted that as a de facto right of veto, other ones didn't. But that has fortunately fallen by the wayside. It's not used very much, and that was done by a change to the rules of procedure of the Council in 1988, I think it was, where it was laid down in the rules that if a single member state requests a vote, or the Commission requests a vote, then a vote will be taken if that proposal is accepted by a simple majority in the Council. That's one vote per member state. If a majority say, okay, we move to a vote, you move to a vote. That clarified that voting should become the norm. Nonetheless, member states generally try to find consensus, but I would contend that it still makes a difference, because if you are trying to find unanimity where there is a right of veto, any minister who doesn't like a proposal can sit back, read his newspaper, just lift his finger and say no at the end and not worry about the proposal being adopted. But if there can be a vote, and then any minister being totally unreasonable, inflexible, not wanting to find compromises, might be outvoted, and he or she knows that. So that minister will sit up and try and negotiate a deal, a compromise, rather than be outvoted. So deliberations that in the past were conducted perhaps under the shadow of a potential veto are now conducted under the shadow of a potential vote. So you have moved away from lowest common denominator decision-taking in the Council. And that's very important, because I mean, if you look at, even a casual observer reading newspapers about the European Union, when does it hit the public that you have a crisis? It's when there is deadlock. The EU can't decide anything. And that's in the fields that need unanimity. Foreign policy, tax matters, treaty change, various things like that, that need unanimity. Normally, if it's a matter that can be dealt with by majority voting, there is a decision within a period of time, and then you can debate the quality of that decision, but at least you don't have paralysis. So that's the very important type of change, both to the treaty, but also to the rules of procedure, and also to the practice that has been crucial. Similarly, the switch to co-decision powers for the European Parliament. Parliament was originally just consulted on legislation, as has been mentioned. Nowadays, almost every piece of European legislation needs the approval of the European Parliament as well as of the Council. So they both have to agree. There are negotiations between them. Who comes out on top in those negotiations? Well, if they agree, of course, they don't need to negotiate. It's when they diverge that it gets interesting, and usually they do, at least on some details. So there is a negotiation. It's called these trilogue meetings. Now, I was once at a conference on the 10th anniversary, I think it was, of co-decision procedure coming in, and this question arose: who has the upper hand in these negotiations? And there was a former chair of a parliamentary committee who had led many of those negotiations, and there was a former president in the office, an Irish minister, I think, from the council. And each one of them said, the other side has far more leverage in these negotiations. The MEP from the parliament said, you guys in the council, you know our positions, you know what they are. We don't know yours. You just say, oh, we wouldn't get a qualified majority for that. Sorry, I can't put that to my colleagues in the council. And we don't know what your positions are in the council. So you have the upper hand in the negotiations. The minister from the council said, no, I come along representing the council, dealing with all these subjects. I'm faced with a phalanx of experts from the relevant parliamentary committee who know the subject inside out, have been following it from the earliest commission proposal to the last stage. They know everything, and you come up with proposals. Oh, well, how about this compromise? And me, I think, oh, that sounds reasonably good. I expect the council might accept that, so I accept it. And I go back to the council and get shouted at afterwards for having made all these concessions to the parliament. Because you guys, you know all the subjects, you've got all your contacts with my colleagues behind the scenes and through your political parties back home and so on. You run rings around me all the time. So it was interesting. Each side thought the other one had the upper hand in these negotiations. In practice, well, we've heard the evidence just now that in agriculture, council seems to, in practice, have the upper hand. If you talk look at environment policy in the strict sense of the word, maybe it's a different view. Maybe you should look at fishing policy. I think that's an interesting one, because the first real revision of reform of the common fisheries policy came after the European Parliament had co-decision powers, and it was largely thanks to the Parliament pushing on that. So that would be a good one for you academics to study as well. I think it varies. Another thing you should perhaps look at, if I'm not speaking for too long, is changes to rules of procedure in the Parliament. And I say that coming back perhaps to the Agriculture Committee as well, because in the Parliament, before negotiating with the Council, when there is divergence on legislation, that increasingly happens ahead of first reading. So the committee adopts a position, and the committee appoints its delegation, the chair, the rapporteur, etc., go and negotiate with the Council to find a compromise. Until 3 or 4 years ago, that happened before the issue went to the Parliament plenary in many cases. 3 or 4 years ago, the Parliament changed its rules of procedure to say the mandate for any negotiations has to first be submitted to the plenary. That means all the other committees are alerted. That means there's discussions in political groups on the positions they will take and how they will vote in plenary. That means it's no longer the little ghetto of members on that committee, be it agriculture or fishing or transport or whatever. It's looked at more widely before the Parliament settles its position and goes off to negotiate. That would be worth academic analysis. Has that rule change affected the policy output? I suspect it may have in some fields, but not in others, but that's my guess from practice. It would be interesting to have some real data on that. And I think those really are my comments. I hope they were useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I will start perhaps this Q&A session with a question that got me by chat to Aron and Viviane. I'm going to read. It says, Angela has mentioned an important factor in her presentation, which is the impact of these rule changes in transparency. To Aron and Viviane, has your paper analyzed or touched upon issues of transparency during the reform?
I don't think we have, Aron, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was as much an issue though, transparency, because I think compared to Angela's field, I mean, the common agricultural policy, when it's reformed, it is for people following agriculture. It is the one show in town. It is, you know, there's perhaps one file or 2 or 3 files, and every eye is on it. So I think, and you know, NGOs are extremely involved in this as well, agricultural representatives as well. So I don't think there was so much an issue of transparency in terms of at least understanding the impact of the policy. Now, of course, understanding why certain states decide certain position or why certain MEPs vote a certain way, that's never going to be extremely transparent. But for now, we haven't done that in the paper. What we are trying to do though, I mean, I think there are concerns definitely about links between the Agri Committee and the farming community. And that's something that we are looking at in further work, where we're finding that actually the kind of the percentage of strong links with farming is staying the same between the Agri Committee in 2009, in 2014 and 2019. The rule change hasn't really opened that up, but that's almost transparent data. That is, you know, declaration of interest by MEPs that is available on the European Parliament website. So yeah, there's a question, but I think it's not so much an issue of transparency. Thank you.
Even better. Thank you, Viviane, for your answer. Sorry, there's a question here from Pedro. Perhaps I'd like to hear some of you about, do you think that the pandemic brought the European Union countries together, and will this make it easier to implement common policies in the future? Does anyone like to fill in on this?
I can start, and then if someone else wants to join. I mean, I think that probably it has made a difference, that the fact that this pandemic was kind of a symmetric shock, right? And that for this kind of economic recovery, it has made a difference, and it has made it really easier to advance with supranational solutions that will probably have a lasting effect, because we might see that it's really kind of a stepping stone towards some further developments in terms of kind of starting to have some sort of like common responses also in terms of taxation and so on. I think that, however, this is probably not the case in other areas, right? So we've seen that, yes, in terms of economic recovery, we see more dialogue and coming together. In other areas like rule of law, the conflicts are still there. Or for instance, if we look at issues like migration, asylum, the conflicts are still there, and that is not going to change because of the pandemic. And there, I mean, a point kind of coming back to what Richard was saying before about this use of unanimity and qualified majority voting and kind of these cases of deadlock. The case of migration, for instance, or of asylum is a very nice one to show that in some areas there is this persistence of not just consensus but even unanimity, right? And so, for instance, the fact that some member states actually force the others to decide these issues by unanimity, by pushing decisions to the European Council and saying, well, you know, it should be decided by heads of state and government and not by the Council. That kind of imposes a fake unanimity rule that doesn't actually exist in the treaties, and is having a really important effect in explaining why we don't have decisions in this area of asylum, right? So it's kind of a new turn, if you want, in this debate about unanimity and consensus and qualified majority voting. But I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to this question.
I think just to add to what you were saying here, because I think a lot of the discussion on rule change tends to be towards more inclusivity, towards more transparency. We've seen, you know, with even the council now being more transparent. But actually, what we see with crisis, whether that's the economic crisis, but also COVID, is that, and the migration crisis, is that can move back, can have reduction in transparency, reduction in who gets to make these decisions, with Angela's examples as well of using non-legislative rules. I think that's something that we are doing much more, understand much more, looking at the EU, is that integration doesn't only go in one direction, but also decision-making doesn't always go towards more democratic, more open, and more transparent.
May I add some? The biggest impact of the COVID pandemic has been the creation of the NGEU, the borrowing and lending, borrowing and spending facility, and the EU issuing sovereign bonds. That's an idea that's been around for many years and never been adopted. It was thanks to the economic consequences of the pandemic that it was actually adopted, and that's quite a historic decision. There have been quite a few smaller ones reinforcing the European Medicines Agency and the capacity of the Commission to buy and stockpile protective equipment, that sort of thing. But at the beginning of this seminar, Ariadna mentioned the impacts on remote voting in the Parliament and in the Council and so on, which is of course a temporary impact. But I'll just mention out of interest here that if the European Parliament hadn't found a way of allowing remote debating and voting without needing to change its rules of procedure, because it couldn't do that because you have to assemble everybody from across Europe, exchanging the virus and going home again to vote through a rule change. It would have been catastrophic. If you hadn't been able to do that under its existing rules, then the European Parliament would not have been able to meet. So anything legislative or budgetary would have been blocked in the Union. So the fact that the Parliament was able to find a way of doing that was quite crucial during this crisis period. I was involved in that a little bit. But what was quite visible is that although Parliament was able to perform its core functions, it performed them less well. Because remote voting with a remote debating, where you can't get around a table go out for a quick coffee if necessary to bargain and find a compromise, explore things informally. It all became much more rigid and much more difficult to operate. And I expect that was the same in other institutions as well, but particularly in the Parliament. That's a slight digression from what we were saying, but it also shows how it's rules and practice together that determine outcomes.
Thank you for your answers. I would perhaps conclude this webinar with the questions to our editors for the academic segment of our webinar. Perhaps start by you, Angela, and then if Ariadna wants to step in. So Ariadna made a good overview of the issue in the beginning, and I'd like to ask you, now that the issue is published, and Richard has helped us a little bit with a half an answer, what now? So where do we go from here? What's the next step in researching this topic? If you had to reframe the issue now, how would you do it?
Thank you for your question. That's a tough one. Reframe it. I don't think we need to reframe it, because the original idea is actually to fill a gap in what is already there, that we have a lot of studies on different small sectors. We have a lot of studies on the whole EU legislative procedure, but then we don't know exactly, and the two areas don't communicate. So I don't think there is a need to reframe it. I would actually think that there is a need to go into different policy areas, because even our issue is quite limited. We saw actually it was a long process, but I think we spent 2 years, because we had 2 sessions with the CPR and then the actual processing of writing. And we saw from the people who were interested in writing on that most of them were interested in very salient issues like migration, like the macroeconomy sector, everything that's finance, areas that are salient now and that attracted a lot of academic attention, but we still lack information on very, I would say, routine areas like the single market. Nobody's interested in it, or like fisheries, like Richard said. And actually, even if we're looking at textbooks for students, we are still lacking information and an overview across temporal and across policies. And those areas that are there, some of them that generate a lot of legislative activity, but we still don't know what's happening inside those sectors. Is it the same as in those areas that we're studying? Luckily, Vivian and Aron looked at CAP, because this was also one of those areas that is understudied. But there are a lot of areas that still are understudied. So I would say that this is one particular direction that is interested to go in and to explore more, because we lack a lot of information.
Thank you, Angela. I don't know, Ariadna, if you would like to add anything.
No, I mean, I hope that we've provided also some puzzles also for some other researchers that might want to indeed then go further into some of these questions of, you know, what happens with this kind of non-legislative instruments, when are they used, when are they applied? And I think that what it shows also is that, and that's a bit also something that Aron and Vivian were mentioning at the beginning of their presentation about the need for dialogue between people who come from this policy side, so from policy analysis, policy studies, and then the people who come from the institutional side, so more from this kind of institutionalist studies, and that often we don't talk to each other. So there are people doing studies on policies, some people doing studies on institutions, but they don't really talk to each other. And I think that by doing that, by bringing these people together and also using different tools of institutional analysis and policy analysis, then maybe we can also uncover new puzzles and find new answers as to why we have certain type of policies, or more policy stability than policy change in different areas of the EU.
Thank you, Ratib, to our researchers up there. I would like to thank you again for this webinar. 2 concluding notes. So the thematic issue in which this event was based is available on our website. I have pasted the link in the chat. Feel free to access, read, share site anytime, anywhere. As always, it's fully open access. Also, the recording of this webinar will be soon uploaded to our YouTube channel. To our speakers and the audience, you will be notified once the video is on. Again, I would like to thank you, all the speakers, Richard, for your remarks, Ariadna, Angela, for your presentations and for helping us putting on this webinar, Aron, Vivienne, for your presentations as well. And of course, a great thank you as well to our attendees for their questions and interaction with our speakers. I'll see you all in our next webinar. Thank you very much.